to the Passenger Seat Podcast, a podcast designed to fill your passenger seat with chat about classic cars, all recorded from my 1968 Morris Minor Peggy. I'm Becca, and today I'm going to be talking about some of the struggles I had replacing Peggy's alternator, and going into kind of why upgrading parts sometimes makes your life a little bit harder in the short term, but hopefully can make it a little bit better in the long term. So towards the end of November, early December it must have been, I noticed that Peggy wasn't charging quite right, and it was coming up on my voltmeter that I've got down here as not being enough, and then the red light came on the speedo, the red light of doom, as it's been affectionately called in my family. And so when I realised that actually that wasn't turning off even under kind of high revving, I was like, okay, I think something's unfortunately going wrong here. So I started by looking into kind of what my options were, whether the fan belt was loose, but no, that was fine, whether the battery had just died and wasn't really taking charge anymore, and again, that was kind of okay, not really an issue, even though I've had this battery for a little while now. So kind of narrowed it down to indeed being the alternator, and I'd got quite lucky really, because the alternator we fitted when we replaced the dynamo after that died about maybe 3 years ago now. And actually a lot of young members had had issues with getting alternators and alternator conversion kits, and there being an issue with the alternator after just a few runs really. And so I'd got 3 years out of it, nowhere near the years that we'd got out of the original dynamo, which is worth thinking about really, because the original dynamo had clearly served Peggy for nearly 50 years and kept going. So a real reflection on the quality of parts that after 3 years I'm having to replace my replacement alternator. But I'd done the conversion because there's so many little electrical bits here, and it was about the same amount of money and seemed like a good idea. So the alternator had died, and because so many young members had been having issues with the ones that come in the conversion kits and that you get from ESM, a couple had tried out a few different options, and one, Harry, had found that this one that he'd found on eBay that's actually a little bit higher output for a Mini works really well, doesn't seem to have the immediate issues that so many were facing with the ones from ESM at the moment. So I went for one of those, and I asked Harry, was it kind of a straight swap from a regular alternator? Was there anything that was likely to be an issue? And he said that there was sometimes some problems with alignment at the front, that it was a little bit too far forward, and so you might have to kind of shave a little bit off of the alternator there, but otherwise you'd be fine. Well, actually I'd noticed that my existing alternator was sitting probably a little bit too far back than was ideal, so replacing it with one that typically sits a little bit further forward seemed like it would actually solve a slight issue that I'd noticed more recently. So I got one on order, and it arrived very quickly. Hilariously, it comes from what seems to be a pet shop, primarily on eBay, at least that's what the name suggests, but indeed they sell Mini alternators as well, and ones that work, so that's great. So it arrived, and I was like, right, it's basically 3 bolts, swap, put the new fan belt on, sorted. I was there when I fitted the previous conversion kit. I know how to adjust my alternator to sort out kind of if a fan belt's got loose, so really shouldn't be too much of an issue. I can do this myself at home with my tools, etc. I was feeling pretty confident about it, and it's a really nice thing to go into a job thinking, considering that, again, when I got Peggy, hadn't even checked oil and water, and I feel I've come a decent way in getting a lot better at knowing how all of the engine goes together, getting to grips with doing little bits and pieces, and feeling a little bit more hands-on. So I get the old alternator off with no issue, and pretty pleased with that. Comes off, all sorted. I can see that it's pretty worn down, and that it's looking tired, and I sit it kind of side by side with the new alternator to just kind of check whether there'd be any kind of obvious issues before I go into fitting it. And as Harry said, it was kind of a little bit further forward, and it did look kind of a little bit bigger, but not hugely different, and I guess I should have taken that really as my warning. And I went about attaching it. So started off with putting the 2 bolts in at the top, getting it in, and then trying to line the bottom one up, and I could not get the bottom one into a position that would line up with the hole on the adjuster. I hadn't moved the adjuster because I knew that meant that the fan belt was pretty tight, and I could work from there, and I just couldn't get it far enough up to actually be able to put the bolt through. And I kind of was trying to take photos, and I mean, thank goodness for like smartphones and being able to do that, because you can get a smartphone into some fantastic positions to take a photo and get an idea of what's going on that you can't with your own eyes and things like that. So thank goodness for those, I guess. But all I could see that was in the way was the engine mount, and the engine mount hadn't moved, and I couldn't work out what on earth was going on and why it wasn't doing what it was supposed to do. So I then started by kind of putting the bottom bolt in, the one that goes through the adjuster, and trying to lever the top part into the 2 top bolts. And again, I couldn't get it past this point, and that point was being created by the engine mount. And I think I must have spent a good couple of hours trying different things out. I eventually removed the adjuster, and was then like, well, if I can get it the other side of the engine mount with the adjuster, sort it out that way, and then lever it in that way, maybe that will sort it out. And I was just getting nowhere, and I was getting quite frustrated in a chat with some friends who were really helpful about giving me some advice about it, and Harry, who had done it before, hadn't had any of this issue. So I don't know what's making mine different, because we're both on a 1098cc engine, we were both putting in the same alternator, we've got no other modifications in the area that were altering it, but I was just having a huge problem with this engine mount, well, mainly the engine mount bolt really being in the wrong position, that was just kind of catching on it. And in the end, after a couple of hours and it being absolutely cold, and I was just so fed up with it, I got quite annoyed. And then it just so happened that my parents rang me at that time, and I was annoyed and angry at the situation, and my dad was like, well, just leave it, put it in a way that you can drive over tomorrow, because luckily I don't live too far away from them, and we'll have a look at it together. So I did that, and again, luckily it's a cold time of year, wasn't too much of an issue to drive across without the fan belt on, because these Morris Minors are so well cooled, and I just took it gently, enough air flow coming kind of through to keep things cool enough, but no kind of rotation from the pulleys and stuff like that. But made it over with no issue really, and we started kind of looking into it, and as I thought, weirdly it was indeed this engine mount bolt that was in the way. We'd kind of done it so that we knocked it so that it marked it, so we could see that is indeed where the issue was. And so it was a case of there was nothing I could have done the previous day back home that was going to solve that problem. Instead, we were going to have to file away at some of the kind of hole casing on the alternator to make that a different shape so that it could get past. And in the end, we also had to kind of file away a little bit at the nut and bolt that's on the engine mount in the hope to get it past. Because the reality is, could I have looked into ordering a different alternator, perhaps the alternator that I had before? Yeah, but I know that there's an issue with those, and I needed the car up and running, and I needed a part that was going to fit, and I couldn't afford to try and send this part back after I'd been messing about with it for a few days, because it was quite evident that I'd been messing about with it for a few days, and they were probably going to say, well, you've damaged the goods kind of thing. So it was a real like, oh, we've got to make this part fit. And so a word of warning really in terms of making these changes. And even on an identical car like Harry's car is, so something that fits somebody else's engine bay and goes in with no problems and only minimal adjustment isn't necessarily going to fit your car for some unknown reason. And in the end, yes, we got it fitted, but it was not going to be the kind of hour-long job that I probably thought it was in the first place. It ended up being so much longer. But we got there, we got it sorted, we got it fitted, and so far it's doing really well. Obviously, this time of year, you've got headlights on, you've got window wipers on, you've got my heated rear windscreen on, potentially. Lots of things going, and it's coping fantastically well, and I've done far more trips than some young members managed on those other alternators at the time. And who knows, it might well be that we'll get to a point in a few years' time where the alternators that we're all buying off of this eBay store are having issues, and the ones from other sources are back to be good again. But it's a real struggle when you're thinking, okay, this is great, I'm going to be able to do this job by myself, I've got this part that everyone else is finding really good and fitting really well, and actually I'm having to go through all of this palaver to make it fit. Ultimately though, a Morris Minor I still think about being so much better than some alternatives. I remember not long after we'd done the alternator conversion on Peggy, when I was still at the uni, one of my students had come in and she was running late because she'd had to get a lift with her partner because her car had gone in for an alternator replacement, and it was a modern car, a modern Volvo I think it was, that was still on warranty, but even so it was going to cost her an additional couple of £100 for them to do the work and get it fitted and done as quickly as she needed it done. And I said, well, my alternator cost me 70 quid and we fitted it in an afternoon. And so yes, this situation cost me 2 afternoons really worth of time, but I was able to kind of make it work and be able to do it myself and have a better understanding of kind of what I can do in that situation in future. And ultimately, if Peggy wasn't a forever car and a car that I don't ever intend on anybody else wanting to kind of put back and make original, then I'd perhaps have looked into a different alternator again that didn't need those sorts of changes being made. But it's my car and I don't see it being kind of anybody else's for a very long time, if ever, with the way that some things are going. So it was a case of getting it up and running as quickly as possible and make it working again in a way that suited my budget, my time constraints, and what I know about the options that are out there. I've got a few other little jobs that I need to get done on Peggy, and again it's not going to be totally straightforward because the parts aren't exactly original, and so there's some slight changes that will have to be made to them to make it fit. And it's all the fun of these cars, isn't it? Keeping them on the road isn't always straightforward. Yes, we're really lucky with Morris Minors that there's a huge amount of parts availability out there and that you've got options, but there's certainly some things that you have to kind of make do and amend with to keep them going, and with other cars even more so. But we are really lucky that we are able to kind of do those things and get on with them, rather than be reliant on dealerships and parts coming in from them and them doing it either within warranty or with lots of extra labour hours on top. So they do have their benefits, even if on that particular morning going into afternoon when I was struggling to get this new alternator fitted, I was quite frustrated and annoyed. And of course, as a result of doing the work and asking people for help and working on it, I've got those friendships and that support network that are there at times when it's problems with myself, not just the car, and that's always a fantastic thing to have. And we're really lucky within the car community about the friendships that we get to make because of our passion for strange little vehicles. I hope you've kind of enjoyed hearing about my struggles, I guess, and perhaps it's inspired you to get on with that job that you've been putting off because you're a bit nervous about how it's going to go. It's well worth having a go and seeing how it goes, and then if need be, calling in the backups and reserves. And I'm hopeful that you've got such a good support network as well. I will obviously be bringing you along for any other little bits and pieces we've got to do on Peggy in the upcoming months, and obviously lots of exciting events coming in 2025 too. I hope any of you that managed to make it out on New Year's Day or some of the postponed New Year's Day events enjoyed yourselves as well, and I'd love to hear where you ended up going. And in the meantime, thank you ever so much for listening. Drive safely and happy motoring.